Before we begin, I just want to say that this video discusses a real and deeply tragic case involving loss of life, as well as sensitive topics that may be difficult for some viewers. My intention is never to cause harm or distress, but to share these stories with care, respect, and awareness. Some details may be limited out of consideration for those involved, and I encourage you to watch with that in mind. And if this case feels like it may be too much for you, please feel free to click away and take care of yourself first. For those of you still here, thank you for being here. And with that said, let's begin. In August 1989, inside a luxury home in Beverly Hills, a brutal double murder would shock the world. Jose Menendez and Kitty Menendez were found shot to death in their own living room. At first, it appeared to be a targeted attack, possibly even a professional hit. But as the investigation unfolded, suspicion began to shift much closer to home. Because the truth behind this case wasn't just shocking, it was deeply complicated and would divide opinion for decades to come. This is the story of the Menendez brothers. Lyle Menendez was born on January 10th, 1968, and Erik Menendez was born on November 27th, 1970, to Jose and Mary Louise Kitty Menendez. Their father, Jose, was a successful corporate executive who immigrated from Cuba and built a prosperous career in the United States, working for companies like Hertz and RCA Records. The family initially lived in New Jersey before moving to Beverly Hills, California, where they enjoyed a life of privilege and luxury. Despite their affluent lifestyle, the Menendez brothers' early life was marred by trauma and abuse. Reports indicate that Jose Menendez was a controlling and abusive father, subjecting both Lyle and Erik to emotional and physical abuse. Allegations of sexual abuse emerged later, with both brothers claiming they were victims of their father's actions. Lyle reportedly faced abuse from a young age, and after confronting Jose, Erik became the new target of the abuse. The brothers attended prestigious schools, including Princeton Day School and Beverly Hills High School. While Lyle was outgoing and confident, Erik was more introverted and struggled with anxiety and self-esteem issues. Both boys exhibited behavioral problems during their youth, including engaging in petty crimes. Erik even sought therapy for suicidal thoughts, indicating the emotional toll of their home life. The Menendez brothers' experiences of abuse and their tumultuous family dynamics profoundly affected their psychological development. Their relationship with each other was complex. They leaned on one another for support amidst the chaos of their home life. This bond would later play a crucial role in their defense during the murder trials of their parents. In the days leading up to the murders, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez began making preparations. On August 18th, 1989, the brothers visited several gun stores across Southern California, initially attempting to purchase handguns. But due to issues with identification and a mandatory waiting period, they were unable to complete the purchase. Instead, they made a different decision. The brothers traveled to San Diego, where they entered a sporting goods store and purchased 2 Mossberg shotguns along with ammunition. During the purchase, a driver's license was used, one that did not belong to them. It had been taken from a friend, allowing the transaction to go through, and with that they left the store, armed and ready. On the evening of August 20th, 1989, Jose Menendez and Kitty Menendez were at home in their Beverly Hills mansion, spending a quiet evening together watching a film in their den. It was a normal moment, one that gave no indication of what was about to happen. At some point that night, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez entered the room, armed with loaded shotguns. What followed was sudden and devastating. Multiple shots were fired in quick succession, turning what had been a calm evening into a scene of chaos. Both Jose and Kitty were critically injured during the attack. The violence of that night shocked investigators, not only because of its intensity, but because it took place inside what should have been a place of safety. By the time it was over, both victims had died from their injuries. In the moments after the killings, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez remained inside the house for a short time, waiting. They appeared to expect that the sound of gunfire would bring an immediate police response. But when no one arrived, they left the scene. Over the next few hours, they attempted to distance themselves from what had happened. clothing linked to the attack was disposed of, and the weapons were later buried along Mulholland Drive. They then tried to create an alibi, heading to a nearby cinema with the intention of buying tickets for the film Batman. However, after realizing that the tickets were time stamped, they abandoned the plan. Instead, they traveled to a local event, the Taste of LA Festival, before eventually returning home. By this point, there was still no sign of police presence. Shortly after, Lyle Menendez placed a call to emergency services, telling the operator that someone had killed his parents. In the background, Erik Menendez could be heard crying and shouting. When officers arrived, both brothers ran toward them, appearing distressed. They told police they had only just returned home and had discovered the scene. At the time, investigators did not carry out gunshot residue tests, which may have indicated whether either of them had recently fired a weapon. In those early hours, the brothers suggested that the killings could have been linked to business dealings, raising the possibility of a targeted attack. When police and forensic teams entered the home, the scene they were met with was unlike anything they had experienced before. Officers later described it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered, with clear signs of extreme violence throughout the room. The level of damage left behind made it immediately clear that this was not a random or quick attack. Investigators noted the intensity of what had taken place and how much force had been used during the killings. Detectives who worked the case would later speak about how difficult the scene was to process, even for those who had seen many homicides before. It was, by all accounts, a deeply shocking and unsettling environment. The findings from the autopsies confirmed the severity of the attack, showing that both victims had suffered multiple injuries. The nature of those injuries further reinforced just how brutal the events of that night had been. In the early stages of the investigation, detectives considered the possibility that the murders were linked to organized crime. The level of violence, combined with Jose Menendez's business connections, made it seem like a plausible theory. For a time, attention remained focused outside of the family, but as the weeks turned into months, something began to stand out. The behavior of Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez started to raise concerns. Following the deaths of their parents, the brothers began spending large amounts of money, luxury items, expensive purchases, and frequent travel quickly became part of their lives. Lyle invested in a restaurant, bought high-end watches, and purchased a sports car. Meanwhile, Erik focused on tennis, hiring a full-time coach, and competing in tournaments overseas. Rather than remaining in the family home, the brothers chose to move into separate luxury condominiums in Marina del Rey, leaving the Beverly Hills mansion behind. They were also seen dining in expensive restaurants and traveling abroad, including trips to the Caribbean and London. To investigators, this shift in lifestyle felt difficult to ignore. As time went on, the brothers' lifestyle continued to attract attention. At one point, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez were even seen courtside at a New York Knicks game, an appearance that was later captured in the background of a basketball trading card. By this stage, it was estimated that the brothers had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, reportedly around $700,000 in total. A significant portion of this money came from a life insurance payout following the deaths of their parents. For investigators, this raised serious questions. The scale of the spending, and how quickly it happened, began to suggest a possible financial motive. However, not everyone agreed. Some family members pushed back against this idea, stating that the brothers' spending habits had not dramatically changed and that their behavior should not be directly linked to the murders. Still, the attention surrounding them continued to grow. As the investigation continued, new information began to surface, and it would change everything. A key development came when a man named Signorelli contacted police, claiming that Erik Menendez had confessed to him. He also mentioned a screenplay they had worked on together, one that appeared to mirror the details of the case in a way that raised serious concern. In response, police arranged for Signorelli to meet with Erik while wearing a wire, hoping to capture a recorded confession. But during that meeting, Erik denied any involvement. At the same time, investigators began hearing other accounts. A friend of Lyle Menendez told police that shortly after the killings, Lyle had made a sudden trip back home, claiming he needed to remove something from the family computer. It was suggested that this may have been linked to a will that could have affected inheritance. As pressure mounted, the case took another major turn. Erik Menendez eventually confessed to his psychologist, Jerome Oziel. That information was later shared beyond the sessions and would ultimately reach police. Not long after, both brothers were arrested. Lyle Menendez was taken into custody outside the Beverly Hills home, while Erik Menendez returned to Los Angeles and turned himself in days later. From that moment on, the case would never be the same. As the case moved forward, the focus shifted to what evidence would be allowed in court, and one key piece would become central to everything. In August 1990, a judge ruled that recordings of conversations between Erik Menendez and his psychologist, Jerome Oziel, could be used as evidence. The decision was based on claims that confidentiality had been broken, making the recordings admissible. That ruling was quickly challenged, leading to delays that stretched the case out for years. It wasn't until 1992 that a higher court confirmed most of the recordings could be used, with only limited exceptions. Following that decision, the case moved forward rapidly. A grand jury formally charged Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez with the murders of their parents. Early suggestions that the killings were purely financially motivated were later dropped, but the charges remained extremely serious. The brothers were charged with first-degree murder, along with special circumstances that made them eligible for the death penalty. In January 1993, it was officially announced that prosecutors would seek the death penalty, raising the stakes of the case even further. When the trial of the Menendez brothers began in July 1993, it quickly became one of the most widely followed cases in the country. Cameras were allowed inside the courtroom, and the proceedings were broadcast to the public, drawing intense attention. Represented by their defense teams, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez did not deny the killings, but their explanation would shape the entire case. They claimed they had acted out of fear, describing what they said was a deeply troubled upbringing. During the trial, the brothers made serious allegations about long-term abuse within the home, stating they believed their lives were in danger. These claims became central to the defense and would go on to divide opinion for years to come. According to their testimony, tensions within the family had escalated in the weeks leading up to the killings. They described confrontations, fear, and a growing sense that something was about to happen. The defense argued that the brothers believed they were in immediate danger and that their actions were driven by that fear. But the prosecution presented a very different narrative. They argued that the murders had been planned in advance, pointing to the earlier purchase of weapons as evidence. Recordings and statements were used to suggest that this was not an act of self-defense, but a calculated decision. They also challenged the idea that there was any immediate threat, stating that the evidence did not support a situation where the brothers' lives were in danger at that moment. As both sides presented their arguments, the case became increasingly complex. As the trial continued, prosecutors worked to challenge the brothers' version of events. They argued that the allegations raised during the defense had not been mentioned in the immediate aftermath of the murders, but had instead emerged months later, once a legal strategy was being formed. They pointed to earlier conversations and statements, noting that these claims had not appeared in initial discussions or recordings. To the prosecution, this raised serious doubts about their credibility. Throughout the trial, it was argued that Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez were capable of maintaining a detailed and consistent story, even if it was not true. The suggestion was that their account had been carefully constructed to avoid the most severe consequences. At one point, the jury was played the emergency call made on the night of the murders. Prosecutors used it to suggest that the emotion heard in that moment may not have been genuine, but instead part of a performance. As both sides continued to present their arguments, the case became even more divided. As the trial unfolded, another detail emerged that would further complicate how the case was viewed. Before taking the stand, Lyle Menendez had contacted an ex-girlfriend asking her to support part of his story. However, instead of agreeing, she reported the conversation to the police. When Lyle later testified, this information was brought forward. In an unexpected move, he addressed it during questioning by his own lawyer, admitting to what had happened before the prosecution had the chance to raise it. For many following the case, this moment raised further questions about credibility and added another layer of complexity to an already divided trial. During the trial, members of the extended family were called to give evidence. adding further depth to the brothers' claims. One of those witnesses was a cousin, Diane Vandermolen, who told the court that years earlier, Lyle Menendez had confided in her about alleged abuse. She recalled raising concerns at the time, but said the situation was dismissed, and the subject was never spoken about again. Under questioning, she also confirmed that she had not personally witnessed any abuse, something the prosecution highlighted during the trial. Another relative, Andy Cano, gave evidence that Erik Menendez had spoken to him about inappropriate behavior when they were younger. His testimony supported parts of the defense's case, but was also challenged in court. Prosecutors questioned the reliability of these accounts, suggesting that loyalty to family members could influence what was being said. A defense consultant, Ann Burgess, raised concerns about the role of Jerome Oziel. She suggested that his approach may have influenced the way the brothers spoke during recorded sessions, describing his behavior as controlling and potentially leading. Oziel's former partner, Judalyn Smith, also gave evidence, supporting the idea that he had attempted to maintain control over the brothers by recording their conversations. However, her testimony was challenged by the prosecution, who pointed out her complicated history with Oziel and questioned her motivations. At the same time, parts of the brothers' testimony raised further debate in court. Some of the details discussed were unusual and difficult to verify, leading to questions about their reliability. The prosecution challenged these claims, suggesting alternative explanations for the tensions within the family, though not all of these arguments were allowed to be fully explored during the trial. As these conflicting accounts were presented, the case became increasingly difficult to untangle. As the trial went on, further statements added to the complexity of the case. During his testimony, Erik Menendez spoke about his upbringing and the pressures he felt within his family, describing confusion, fear, and a struggle to understand his situation. These personal accounts became part of a much wider debate in court, with both sides attempting to shape how the jury understood the family dynamic. At the same time, the prosecution attempted to introduce additional material they believed could support their argument. This included a screenplay Erik had written years earlier with a friend, which featured a storyline involving a wealthy young man who kills his parents. However, the judge ruled that the script could not be used as evidence, deciding that it had been written too long before the events of 1989 to be considered directly relevant to the case. With decisions like this shaping what the jury could and could not see, the direction of the trial continued to evolve. As the trial drew to a close, further legal decisions shaped how the case would be presented to the jury. The court ruled that certain language could not be used, deciding it may unfairly influence how the brothers were perceived. This was part of a wider effort to ensure the trial remained as fair as possible. Expert witnesses also gave their opinions on the brothers' behavior. A psychologist described some of their past actions as possible signs of emotional distress during adolescence, offering an alternative perspective on their behavior in the years before the murders. When it came time for the jury to decide, the outcome was anything but straightforward. Deliberations revealed a clear divide in opinion, with jurors struggling to agree on what they believed had truly happened. After weeks of discussion, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision. In January 1994, the trial ended in a mistrial. Rather than accepting a lesser charge, prosecutors made the decision to move forward with a second trial, ensuring that the case was far from over. When the second trial of the Menendez brothers began, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Unlike the first trial, cameras were no longer allowed in the courtroom, reducing the level of public exposure and media influence. During this trial, Erik Menendez spent several days giving detailed testimony about his upbringing and the experiences he claimed had taken place within the family. However, the court placed limits on how much of this testimony could be presented, narrowing the scope of what the jury would hear. Lyle Menendez chose not to testify in this trial, a decision that would not go unnoticed. At the same time, the prosecution focused heavily on credibility. Witnesses returned to discuss earlier events, including claims that Lyle had attempted to influence testimony. Letters were also introduced, which prosecutors argued showed efforts to shape how others would speak in court. The defense challenged this evidence, questioning its reliability and authenticity. But the issue remained a significant part of the case. As the second trial progressed, the focus became sharper and the arguments more direct. As the second trial continued, both sides focused heavily on the credibility of the brothers' claims. Prosecutors challenged Erik Menendez's account, questioning why he had not left the family home if he felt he was in danger. They pointed to opportunities he may have had to remove himself from the situation, arguing that his actions did not reflect someone trapped without options. In response, Erik described the level of fear he felt, explaining that he believed he would not be safe no matter where he went. He maintained that the situation was far more complicated than it appeared from the outside. Expert witnesses were brought in by both sides, offering very different interpretations. A defense expert suggested that Erik showed signs consistent with trauma, which could support his version of events. However, a prosecution expert disagreed, stating that there was no clear way to confirm this, and argued that some of Erik's actions appeared inconsistent with that explanation. As closing arguments approached, the defense maintained that the brothers acted out of fear, believing they were in danger if certain truths were revealed. The prosecution, however, continued to argue that there was not enough evidence to support an immediate threat. In the end, the judge ruled that the claim of self-defense did not meet the legal threshold required. However, the jury was still allowed to consider whether part of what happened may have been driven by heightened emotion, particularly in relation to their father. Even so, the full picture remained deeply contested. As the trial reached its final stages, more details were presented that the prosecution argued pointed toward motive. Testimony was given that, shortly after the killings, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez had attempted to locate important financial documents, including a will. According to witnesses, a safe believed to contain these documents was opened, but found to be empty. For the prosecution, this was presented as further evidence that the brothers were focused on their parents' finances in the immediate aftermath. The defense, however, continued to challenge the interpretation of these actions. After years of investigation, 2 trials, and countless hours of testimony, the case finally came to an end. During the final phase of the trial, further concerns were raised about how the defense had been handled. There were claims that certain actions taken during the case may have affected how evidence was presented. However, no criminal investigation was ultimately pursued in relation to these concerns. The defense later argued that these issues had impacted the outcome of the case, filing motions in an attempt to challenge the proceedings. They claimed that the brothers had not received a fair process during this stage of the trial. Despite these arguments, the court moved forward with sentencing. In July 1996, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez were officially sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentences were to be served consecutively, marking the final legal outcome of the case. Following their conviction, Lyle Menendez and Erik Menendez continued to challenge the outcome through the legal system. In the years that followed, multiple appeals were filed in both state and federal courts. However, each attempt to overturn the conviction was ultimately denied, with courts upholding the original verdict and sentencing. By the mid-2000s, their legal options had largely been exhausted. For many years, the case remained closed, but public interest never faded. In more recent developments, new claims and pieces of information have emerged, bringing the case back into discussion. In 2023, a request was made for a new hearing, based on allegations connected to events from the past. These claims, along with previously undisclosed material, have been cited as part of ongoing efforts to revisit aspects of the case. While these developments have renewed attention, the original convictions still stand, and the debate surrounding this case continues. Even decades after the case first shocked the world, the story of the Menendez brothers continues to evolve. In October 2024, Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascon announced that his office was actively reviewing the case. Just weeks later, he confirmed that he would be asking the court to reconsider the brothers' sentencing, a move that could make them eligible for parole. In his statement, he acknowledged the level of planning involved in the crime, but also spoke about the environment the brothers had grown up in, describing it as deeply dysfunctional. He also pointed to the amount of time they had already served, along with their behavior while in prison, as factors in the decision. A resentencing hearing was initially scheduled for late 2024, but was delayed multiple times, pushing it into 2025. As the timeline shifted, the case once again began to draw public attention. By early 2025, further updates confirmed that a final decision on resentencing was expected later in the year, meaning that, for the first time in decades, the future of the brothers' sentences could potentially change. So even now, this case is not completely over. In May 2025, the case took a significant turn. The Menendez brothers were resentenced to 50 years to life, making them eligible for parole as they had been under the age of 26 at the time of the crimes. For the first time in decades, there was a possibility, however small, that they could one day be released. But just months later, in August 2025, both brothers faced parole hearings, and both were denied. Erik Menendez's request was rejected due to concerns raised about his conduct in prison and the potential risk to public safety. Shortly after, Lyle Menendez was also denied parole, with similar concerns cited during the decision. As it stands today, both remain in prison, with the possibility of another hearing in 2028. While serving their sentences, the personal lives of the Menendez brothers continue to evolve, even behind prison walls. In 1996, Lyle Menendez married Anna Erickson in a ceremony conducted over the phone. However, the relationship later ended in divorce. Years later, he remarried, forming a long-term relationship with Rebecca Sneed, whom he had known for many years before their marriage. That relationship would eventually come to an end in 2024. Erik Menendez also married while in prison. In 1999, he married Tammy Sakaman in a small ceremony held inside the facility. She later spoke publicly about their relationship, describing it as something deeply meaningful to her, despite the circumstances. These relationships offered a glimpse into how their lives continued, even while serving life sentences. This case is one that continues to divide opinion even decades later. It raises difficult questions about truth, about motive, and about what may have really been happening behind closed doors. Some believe this was a calculated act driven by greed, while others believe there may be more to the story. And perhaps that's what makes this case so unsettling, because the truth may never feel completely clear. Thank you for watching Into the Night Stories, and as always, stay safe out there.